B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, March 21st, 2017. There's a lot of news going on. There's a new ban on laptop computers for travelers into the United States from an arbitrary selected list of cities. Trump is on Capitol Hill bullying fellow Republicans into supporting Obamacare repeal. The Supreme Court nominee is dancing around a barrage of questions. But for me, the top story today comes from Steve Horn, the scrappy young investigative journalist who reports for Desmog blog. And this is truly stunning, shocking information. There is a new study that was conducted by Purdue University using an airborne laboratory for atmospheric research. And the findings, I'm not going to drag them out for 20 minutes here. I'm going to get right to it. The findings are that natural gas-fueled power plants that we thought were a much better alternative to coal-fired power plants have been found to emit 120 times more methane than previously estimated. Now, methane has a shorter life than carbon, but it is believed, scientists believe, I just have to take their word for it, that in its shorter lifespan, it is much more dangerous in terms of contributing to the climate change factors. So we've believed that the most environmentally sound approach was to de-emphasize coal power plants, and that's what Trump calls the war on coal, and try to move to cleaner burning natural gas plants. Now, here's the critical part. When it comes to the combustion, coal is still much dirtier than natural gas. But the issue is leaks and other emissions that take place during the transportation and processing and the uploading into the combustion chambers of natural gas. And the belief is that it is the leakage as the primary source of methane emissions. Now, this is a small and preliminary study. They looked at power plants, I believe, in 3 states. They also examined oil refineries and discovered that the methane emissions there are 11 to 90 times higher than the estimates that we have been relying on. Now, what's going to happen? Well, probably nothing, because Trump has proposed really cutting to the bone the EPA budget, including the enforcement of emissions standards and leakage of methane and related matters. So the bullying I referenced, Trump put on his trench coat and sallied forth up to Capitol Hill today, and in a closed-door meeting with Republicans, he made veiled threats. He told lawmakers that many of them would lose their seats in next year's midterm elections if the repeal effort fails. And so he's trying to get all of the Republicans to line up, many of whom will have to hold their noses to support this bill because it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't hurt enough people from their twisted perspectives. And he singled out one member, Mark Meadows of North Carolina, who is the chair of the House Freedom Caucus. Those are the Tea Party knuckle-draggers. And Trump had told Meadows that he's coming for him. But a Congress member, Harold Rogers of Kentucky, who overheard this exchange, said, "The president was kidding around, I think." And Meadows says he doesn't feel intimidated. But I think that was the orange man's intention. And here is a stunning finding, that if you think the repeal and replacement plan that has been put forward so far, and we're going to discuss the minor tweaks that have been made here next, but if you think that the estimate that it would cause 24 million people to lose health coverage, consider this. If you just repeal Obamacare and don't go forward with the Republican replacement, 1 million people would keep their insurance who will lose it under the Republican replacement. So, yes, the cure is worse than the alleged disease that the Republicans claim just has to be dealt with. So, in the last 24 hours, we're told last evening, the White House signed off on changes to the what's called Ryan Care, because they're going to blame him if this approach fails. And I think it will most likely fail. But on the way, we have to assume that it might pass. And so there have been 7 major changes, and I'm going to just tick them off here for you briefly. One relates to Medicaid work requirements. And the New York Times has a handy explainer where they tell you the old language and the new language and who will be happy with this change, who it is designed to appease in order to get them to vote. So this measure, allowing states to make Medicaid recipients prove that they are working or looking for work, this is to appease conservatives, particularly members of the Republican Study Committee that met with Trump last week. Now, the Obama administration, to its credit, refused to allow work requirements, saying, hey, that's not consistent with the goals of trying to cover people and treat health insurance as a right, not some sort of a privilege that you have to earn. So this is, in my view, a huge Neanderthal step backwards. Item 2, the Medicaid block grants. Well, they've tweaked the language. States will have an option to receive lump sum Medicaid payments, and then they can decide who to deny coverage to and how not to spend that money. I am exaggerating, but that is the point that is really in contention here. Then the next item relates to people getting a flat tax credit based on their age, but the Senate might increase funding for Americans between ages 50 and 64. Because the Obamacare plan was based on income, not age, and the subsidies were based on how much money you earned and how much you needed to pay for your health insurance coverage. Instead, the Republicans are going to allow a lot of people with higher incomes to get subsidies for health insurance, and it's just crazy, because the only issue is a cap at $75,000 a year. So the bill will also allow insurers to charge older customers 5 times as much as their cheapest policies. And when you put that combination together, that's where we came up with the 700% increase, I think that was the number from last week, for certain people at age 64 who will lose substantial subsidies and see the cost of insurance go up exponentially. So who will benefit from this? Who likes it? Well, it really is to appeal to people who believe more in age-based systems than class-based or income-based, and that suggests that they think poor people don't need health care and don't need help paying for it. Item 4, the Obamacare taxes. Instead of phasing them out in 2018, they would be phased out this year. It blows a big hole in the budget and the deficit, but the deficit hawk Republicans won't address that because they feel that they're going to please their constituents by fundamentally repealing Obamacare, and that's all they care about. Now, what's interesting is that the Republican bill, let me get my pages right here, it eliminates taxes on health insurance, prescription drugs, tanning salons. Now, that was a very bizarre element that was included in Obamacare to tweak John Boehner, the Orange Speaker of the House at the time. And this appears to be a favor to Trump to reinstate or to repeal the tax on tanning salons. It's bullshit, but that's how they do it. Now, the only item in these changes that I see as a potential improvement is a tweak that reads, Medicaid allotments for older and disabled beneficiaries grow faster than the rate of medical inflation. And this means that they're actually allocating money with an expectation that the people who need it most, older and disabled people, will have higher rates of health care costs than the average person. This is the only rational element that I see in the package. The Yankee swap is a little bit too much in the weeds to talk about, but in upstate New York, there's a battle between counties and the state over who should pay the state's share of Medicaid, and they're trying to win some Republican upstate New York Congress members' votes by making this very localized change. And the last item relates to health savings accounts. The language previously said that if your tax credit was more than your premium, you could keep the difference. But now they're saying, no. You just get a subsidy up to the amount of your expense, not a dime more. And this was insisted on by anti-abortion activists who worried that people might be able to take that money and use it for an abortion. I mean, I think that is so far-fetched and bizarre, but that is how these people think. Fallout continues from the testimony on Capitol Hill yesterday of FBI Director Comey and NSA Director Rogers. And I have to credit Trevor Noah. This guy came in from South Africa a year and a half ago, and he really has grokked the American population and our political system. He talked about Trump's tweeting, which was contradicted in real time by the FBI and NSA directors. Quote, Noah, my favorite part of this long-ass hearing was even though the words coming out of Comey's mouth were bad for Trump, the president still managed to hear something totally different. There's tweets in Congress now? Trump is so gangsta. He lied on Twitter during a hearing about him lying on Twitter. He was live lying the hearing. I'm honestly flabbergasted by this whole thing. That's very well put. In the show file for today's podcast, I've linked to a short wrap-up of the hearing written by Dan Wright over at Shadowproof, and I think he captures it pretty well. Also, an interesting think piece in the New York Times today talks about how Trump's bizarre actions and his compulsive tweeting appear to be losing him support among Republicans, and that all kinds of people are distancing themselves from Mitch McConnell to Peter King, the arch-conservative New York congressman. King says the tweets make it much more difficult for us as we try to build a case against the leakers. We always have to be answering questions about the tweets. It puts us on defense all the time. And Trump told the Tucker Carlson, that little mother, Tucker Carlson, on Fox News last week, I think maybe I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Twitter. But polls and focus groups show that let's see, here's a Fox News poll last week. Only 35% of Trump voters approve of his Twitter habits, and only 16% of all voters approve of them. That's unlikely to alter his behavior, in my humble opinion. And meanwhile, the Washington Post fact-checked the tweets that were lobbed out by the White House yesterday during the congressional hearing. And you can read about it for yourself, but the bottom line is that they issued 4 Pinocchios, meaning that those are flat-out lies, for 4 of Trump's tweets. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Ray Lutz, Aidan McAleer, Andy Krieger, and Sandra Fish. I'm grateful for your support, and you set an example for others. If you have never subscribed and you're in a financial position to do it, come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and you'll get to the sign-up page where it's easy for you to choose a level of support. And I've got bonus books. In fact, we're going to be adding a new bonus book, and people who listen to my latest in-depth interview will get the tip-off on that. That interview is being released today. It's with Thomas Frank, the author of What's the Matter with Kansas, and more recently, an excellent book called Listen Liberal. In Listen Liberal, Frank traces the shifts in the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton and his cronies in the 1990s to become a corporate party of the professional class instead of the party of the working class. And in my in-depth conversation with Tom Frank today, he talks about how the Clinton faction not only took power in the 1990s, but it silenced and squelched many of the progressives who were a part of the Democratic Party at that time. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Tom Frank.
you and I are old enough to remember when the Clinton faction first took over in the in the late 80s and early 90s. And all the other factions that they defeated and then suppressed. And I do mean suppressed. I mean, the Democratic Leadership Council that is gone now, but the people who are, the leading members of that all occupy positions of power and authority in Washington, within the Democratic Party, in journalism, all over the place. These people don't just give up. So there has to be a fight. But let me stoke this a little bit more. The Clinton faction, sold itself to us for years now, decades, as the winning faction. They're the ones that would win national elections. They would give us, they would surrender on principles. They would sell us out in all sorts of different ways, triangulate, move to the center, do all those things. Remember, Bill Clinton was his admirers were very proud of him for doing that, for what would you call it? Like offending the left, hammering the left.
As usual, my conversation with Thomas Frank is rambling and terribly frank, and I think you will enjoy it. And a special shout-out to John Zweibel, a longtime listener and subscriber to the Peter B. Collins podcast. John, we addressed your recent email SOS, and Tom Frank has some great advice for you, so be sure to listen to the podcast as soon as you have a chance. As I mentioned at the top, the dance maneuvers are underway in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And, I've been watching Supreme Court confirmation hearings since Nixon was president. And with a few exceptions, like Bork, the opposing party makes a lot of noise, asks a lot of tough questions, alternating with the party in power that just offers softball questions and a lot of reassuring, nice comments about the nominee. And today it's no different. The biggest thing I want to point out about Neil Gorsuch is that this guy is 49 years old. And if he is confirmed, which I think unfortunately is likely, he will serve on the court for 35 or 40 years. He is a movement conservative. His mother was Ronald Reagan's appointee in the wrecking crew that helped to keep the EPA in check during its early years in the 1980s. And he worked at the Justice Department when Bush was president, and he very effectively dealt with all the questions that were raised. He says, like all the other justices, that no man is above the law, that I've offered no promises on how I would rule to anyone on any case, and particularly that he didn't make any comments to the White House or the recruiters about abortion rights. But one of the interesting things that Pat Leahy, the senator from Vermont, questioned him on is his relationship to Phil Anschutz, the Denver-based billionaire. And in a very polite way, Leahy pointed out that Neil Gorsuch would not be on the Court of Appeals based in Denver today if it weren't for the intervention of his billionaire client, Phil Anschutz. Because when the vacancy was first identified, the White House had 3 women who they saw as finalists for the job. But Anschutz wrote to Harriet Miers, who was George W. Bush's pliable White House counsel, and voila, Neil Gorsuch not only wound up on the short list, but he got the job. Sponsored by billionaire Phil Anschutz. I think that's just one of many damaging elements raised about Gorsuch in the hearings. They will continue. And I encourage the Democrats to be as vocal as possible, as challenging as possible. I hope it will fuel a filibuster, even if the Republicans use the nuclear option and change the filibuster rules. But will the Democrats do that? Based on my conversation with Tom Frank today, while we didn't talk long about the court, I don't think so. A little mid-show musical break, please.
I used to fly with my clothes on till the airline clothing ban. We went from scanning to banning. One airline had tanning, and this was the ad they ran. Fly safe, fly naked, no weapons to find. You're safer with Naked Airlines.
All right, Loose Bruce, can we get to the part about laptops?
No carry-ons, no clothing, no laptops. Well, laptops. And I'm feeling shy.
So as it relates to laptops, the Department of Homeland Security has arbitrarily announced with a very short deadline that passengers on foreign airlines headed to the United States from 10 designated airports in 8 majority Muslim countries may no longer carry electronic devices larger than a cell phone into the cabin. They must check those items, where I don't think they're any more secure than they are in somebody's briefcase. But that's what the rule is. They have announced that the policy takes effect. It took effect at 3 a.m. Eastern Time today, and it must be followed within 96 hours by airlines flying from Amman, Jordan, Cairo, Istanbul, Jeddah and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait City, Casablanca, Morocco, Doha, Qatar, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Now, we're told that this is just to tighten up what they see as a vulnerability. It's very clear from anonymous sources that there is no security threat that has been reported. This appears to be simply an effort to make people feel more scared. Now, about 50 flights a day into the United States are affected by this, and it's just another bizarre move that appears to be driven by some kind of hysterical reaction. Maybe Trump got a tweet, or he was watching Fox and Friends and they told him about this. But this is just another part of airport security theater. Number one, Britain attempted a move like this a few years ago, and the only upshot of it was an increase in thefts from checked baggage. Because baggage handlers and others inside the airport knew that people weren't allowed to carry these valuable devices on board and keep them in their possession. And we also have seen changes in the search protocols at the airport. And this is from the New York Times. Under the new rules, passengers will no longer be allowed to choose what type of searches they undergo in security lines. Now, I routinely opt out of the full-body scanner just because it's the only thing we're allowed to do at the airport. And apparently I will still be able to do that. The language here is a little confusing because later in the article it says that the enhanced pat-down searches will be used on passengers who refuse to go through the full-body screening machine. Now, I've been patted down 50 times, and I really don't care. It's not invasive. They're saying now they're going to use the front of their hand instead of the back of their hand as they go through my junk. But all of this is ridiculous. The greatest improvement in airport security, airline security, came from putting locks on the cockpit doors. The rest of this is a huge waste of our time and money. Random searches and checks are the best way, as opposed to screening everybody who goes through. So there's an explainer piece about this at the Washington Post today, and they debunk claims that this is about security. They note that the United States has not been forthcoming about whether the ban is based on recent intelligence or long-standing concerns. There's no explanation for why electronic devices in the cabin are a concern, but those in the baggage hold are not. And they suggest that this could be an effort to give advantage to American-flagged carriers, because the Emirates Airlines, Etihad Airways, and Qatar Airways have long been accused by their U.S. competitors of receiving massive subsidies from their governments. If this proves to be true, you're going to hear me screaming loud and blood-curdlingly. Now, speaking of these airport searches, the other day the San Francisco Chronicle ran a good article under the byline of Marissa Lang talking about the rights that border agents have to look at your phone, demand that you open it up. They can keep your electronic devices for a week, and they don't have to tell you what they did with them while they were in their custody. And I've linked to this article because it includes 5 important tips called Best Border Practices. Don't travel with your personal phone. Enable password protections on apps. Don't use your fingerprint to unlock your phone because they can force you to put your finger on it, but it's a little harder to get you to hand over a PIN or a password. Have strong passwords, at least 6 characters or more, and don't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And know your rights. Well, we should. But I believe I have constitutional rights that apparently are optional when I'm at the airport. Last night in Los Angeles, Wyclef Jean was working in the studio when L.A. Sheriff's Department officers came by, and they asked him to put his hands up. And before he knew it, those hands were handcuffed. And while he was in handcuffs, he told the cops he planned to sue the police department or the sheriff's department for the way that they were treating him. They kept him in the handcuffs for about 10 minutes, and an associate came by with a smartphone as he videotaped and tweeted out his comments. He said, "I was asked by the police to put my hands up. Then I was told, do not move. I was instantly handcuffed before being asked to identify myself. Now, they proceeded to ignore me. I was treated like a criminal until other police showed up and pointed out they had the wrong person." Well, we now know that there was a suspect who was black and was wearing a bandana with some of the same colors that Wyclef Jean's bandana sported. And the officers said that the suspect had been involved in an armed robbery. So after they released Wyclef Jean, the actual suspect was found about 4 blocks away. And the New York Times on Sunday started a series that I highly recommend. And I can't remember the name of it now, but last year I interviewed a filmmaker who had produced a documentary about this same subject. It is the abusive tactics of police agencies when they use SWAT teams and militarized tactics to invade homes. And they often create more problems than this approach solves, because they come screaming and crashing in on people who aren't expecting it, and their first reaction might be to grab a gun and just shoot. They also describe a case in one instance where the SWAT team came in and tossed a flash bomb into the house, and it fell into a baby bassinet that was occupied. All of this over a $10 meth deal that took place in the front yard of that house a few hours before. Now, this disproportionality and this kind of law enforcement that is designed for cameras to be rolled and, TV news footage to be developed from it, it's got to stop. Here's another case where a wrongful conviction is being compounded, that's the word I was looking for. There's a man who, in New Orleans, 36-year-old William Varnado, and 17 years ago he testified in the murder trial of Duvander Hurst, a man he had known since childhood. He was described as the only eyewitness to take the stand, and he identified Hurst as the gunman in a high-profile killing outside of the Superdome in New Orleans. There was no other physical evidence, and the trial hinged on Varnado's statements. Hurst was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Well, this really bothered Varnado. He said that later he had lied in his testimony. He declared that in a 2013 affidavit. At the time, he was a heroin addict. He had been arrested for drug possession and faced prison time. He was threatened by the detectives, told what to say, and he repeated it all the way through trial. Quote, "At that time, I was strung out on heroin. I was willing to do anything to get back out of police custody and back on the streets. The truth is, I was never at the Superdome on the night of the murder." Now, all that's bad enough. But now he has told the truth, and the district attorney in New Orleans, Leon Canizaro, instead of charging the district attorney and the detectives who forced Varnado to lie on the witness stand, they are threatening to pursue perjury charges. He has been charged, and he faces up to 40 years in prison if convicted. Now, this is a compounded miscarriage of justice, and it happens a lot. A graph here in the article, and this is a magazine-length story at BuzzFeed. I've linked to it in the show file for our podcast today. And since 1989, there are a proven number of at least 2,000 wrongful convictions, and false accusations were a factor in more than half of those, in 56%. And finally today, Andrew Napolitano has been dropped by Fox News. It's not clear if he's been suspended or fired. And, of course, last week he was cited by Sean Spicer in the White House press room as a source for the allegation that the British intelligence unit, GCHQ, provided the wiretaps on Trump during the campaign. Alleged wiretaps, let's put it that way. And he really got hung out to dry. Yesterday we mentioned that a guy named Johnson, Larry Johnson, had come forward as one of the sources for Napolitano. But Fox News, perhaps trying to inoculate itself from any further attacks from the White House, decided to take him off the air. And I think that's a really cowardly move. I don't know if what Napolitano said is true, but I defend his right to speak freely, and his First Amendment right should be unfettered. Thanks for joining me on the Peter B. Collins podcast today. It's available free every day on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.